Thank you. It's really, feel very lucky to be here, and it's been such an inspiring morning. So, I will try and take a bit of a change of tack now because I'm talking about a project here in the Netherlands. Can I just quickly gauge first who in the room is themselves a teacher or educator? Anyone here who is on an administrative side of things, like busy with education but not a teacher? Or and students here. Cool. Oh, just quickly also, people on higher education, and then high school, middle school, anyone? Primary school? Cool, really cool. So I'm here to talk about active learning spaces. My name is Cameron Hope. I work for the Centre for Innovation. I'm a graduate of Leiden University, and I've been working at the Centre for about a year. The Centre is Leiden University's innovation hub. And when I try and explain to people what a Centre for Innovation in a higher education institution would do, I sometimes use this metaphor. And what I used to think this meant was that you have innovation in two phases. You have some people who are out in front, going out to explore something new, pushing the boundaries. And then you have these back leg people who are maybe a little bit stuck in their ways and who need a lot of help to move. But actually over the last year, I've started to realize that what no one talks about, but what I think is the most important part is the middle. Because when you make these loops in the middle, you build up potential energy for innovation. And when you have this potential energy, you tend to find that the solutions that the areas that you go into are more impactful and more relevant to the context. So I have increasingly been trying to focus on the middle. And I do that through a technique called radical listening, among other things. And that's what I want to talk about here today. That's the method I want to talk about, but the project that I'm working on is active learning. Is everyone familiar with active learning as a theory, or anyone currently working in active learning or doing active learning? Cool. Active learning is the name for a broad set of pedagogies that try to increase student participation both in the learning objectives but also the learning activities. And although it's not precisely defined as a list of activities, it is kind of well understood and well studied. This graph on the right-hand side shows that active learning, students who learn in an active way outperform students who learn in a passive way. Fewer of them fail or drop out, and the ones who do pass do so at a higher rate, with a higher average grade. They also tend to test better in analytic capacities. But what this graph on the left shows is that active learning requires a different relationship to space and materials than passive learning, and so much so that sometimes trying to bring active learning into an institution can really take a focus on changing spaces. We know that active learning outperforms passive learning. And what is more good news is that we really know how to make active learning spaces for almost any group size, room size, level of technology, whether it's preschool to PhD into the professional environment, corporate, private sector, government, NGO, or in any type of arrangement. There are lots and lots of good practices, best practices for how to change and arrange space to make it support active learning. And it can be done here, as in the McGill University in Canada, with quite a high budget and a kind of renovation approach. But it can also be done, this is Buddy Taylor Middle School in Florida, with a kind of hands-on DIY approach for a low budget. And this is for a couple €100, you can transform a room to make it active, to activate it for learning. And the outcomes can be really impactful. But so if we know that active learning outperforms passive learning in lots of important ways, and we know how to make active learning spaces for almost any kind of situation, it can seem that there's not really much need for innovation in this area. Like this circuitous, exploratory approach to active learning might seem unnecessary. It might seem like all we have to do is kind of go from here to there. We just identify rooms such as this, in which the furniture is fixed in place, in which one part of the room has freedom for movement and the rest of the part of the room doesn't, and try and just redesign these spaces. We can just get so focused, however, on the solutions and the applicability of the solutions that the solutions start to influence the way that we understand the problem. And this is what I mean by focusing on the middle. is that by taking an approach towards each situation as though it's entirely unique, you can open up more impactful solutions. And one of the ways to do this is a technique called radical listening. Radical listening, in its simplest form, is having a conversation or listening and talking to someone with the intention of uncovering and setting aside your own assumptions of what they mean. In theory, this is really easy to do. When you're talking to someone, you just try and clear away all the solutions that you already know and all the things that you already know, and just let the question that you have sit in a lot of space. Just assume for a moment that you don't already know the answer, even if you may well. And when you actively listen, or when you radically listen rather, two types of things can happen. If you have an implementation type problem, you can pull people around a common narrative. By radically listening to people, you tend to come up with more applicable, more realistic, and more impactful solutions which are unique to that particular context. And as a side note, you're actually primed to lead that community towards those solutions because the solutions are emergent from the community. And on the other hand, you give people the opportunity to choose for themselves whether they understand their situation as an implementation problem, as this back leg problem, or if they want to see this as a front leg problem, and for them, you're giving them the opportunity to make a radical step. Because for them, this change may be dramatic. I want to talk about two examples in which radical listening can deliver you a solution which may seem anticlimactic in the sense that it's something that we're already familiar with. And then I want to talk quickly about two examples in which radical listening can unlock some ideas which are far outside the scope that you may already have started with. So in one example, the now ex-project leader of a faculty project on active learning spaces conducted a series of interviews with teachers asking them, how would you design a space to make it more active? And she had in the back of her mind that there was a project to build a new space in a building to be built in 2020, 2021, heavily funded in tens of thousands of euros. But because she took such a radical listening approach to those interviews, what she found was that in the meantime, a really impactful solution would be to support these teachers to experiment with this active learning pedagogy because they hadn't before. And all that was needed for that was 50 new whiteboards. For a couple €100, the faculty was able to make a really impactful, relevant solution, which would not have been possible if they had been thinking of their answers only in terms of their implication for the design of a new room. To take another example, there's a teacher who has a really active learning pedagogy, but she teaches in a class kind of like this, in which we're on such a steep slope that it's very difficult for you to talk to someone in the row in front or the row behind. The chairs are all bolted in place so that you might be able to talk to someone on either side of you, but to talk to someone at the other end of the row would be impossible. There's also only one place to present and share information. And she was dealing with these types of restrictions. And again, if you were to think of how you would design a lecture theatre like this for active learning from scratch, you would probably clear walkways through the rows. You might add screens on the sides of the wall to allow small groups to project for everyone else to see. You might even think of lowering lowering the gradient of the room. But in this context, what was really needed was a stronger interface between the people who booked the rooms at the start of the semester and the teachers who used those rooms for this semester. In some contexts, that's not very innovative, but in this context, it really is. Now, radical listening can give you some kind of right in front of you type answers, but it can sometimes push you far outside the box of what you originally thought. So we took a question of how to activate spaces for teaching and learning in the medical faculty, and instead of a classroom-based solution, we ended up in a digital space solution. And what we created over the course of many years, and with quite a lot of effort and along a steep learning curve, was a shared digital environment in augmented reality where up to 8 students and an instructor can share interactions with a hologram model. The instructor can change this model to have it present multiple diseases, can add and remove parts of the model to test students' anatomical knowledge. And this space can be created kind of anywhere because it's a hologram. So this leads us far outside the classroom. In another initiative, how to have students working on non-fictional assignments, again took us way outside the classroom and into the Stat Us Lab initiative, in which the Gemeente of Leiden, University of Leiden, Hogeschool Leiden, and the Medical College all came together to set society-based research agendas, in which students would take lessons out into society and make real-world studies, only later to reflect on these in their educational institutions. Again, this is creating an active learning space, but it's not a classroom in the traditional sense, and it's not one which is really informed by best practices. It's something kind of outside the box. So the practice of radical listening sounds really easy, and in one sense it is. It is a kind of mindset of openness towards the implications of the people that you deal with, and it's a commitment to listening to what they say, even if it's not what you hope they're going to say. It can take you some places that you're comfortable with. It can take you some places that you're uncomfortable with. But all I will say is that innovation should always be highly context-specific. What is impactful here is not necessarily impactful over there. And unless you focus on the middle, you may end up with the legs going in different directions. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.